Hello and welcome to revision tips for SIPS Level 6 Professional Diploma in Procurement and Supply. This is Module 8, Innovation in Procurement and Supply. And we're looking at learning outcome 3, which is to understand the environmental factors that can affect supply chain involvement, improvement and innovation. In 2018, Greenpeace launched a campaign tracing plastic litter found on beaches around the world back to brands under which the plastic was sold to the consumer. And none of these brands, which included Coca-Cola, Unilever and PepsiCo, actually manufactured the plastic packaging, now clogging up the oceans. So rather, they produced the packaging from suppliers, but neither pressure groups like Greenpeace nor the general public care about the distinction. It's the brand at the top of the value chain which is held responsible for the litter, and it's therefore imperative that organisations take responsibility for environmental issues in and arising from the whole supply chain. So life cycle analysis is defined as the process of measuring materials and/or the energy flows over the entire life cycle of a product, and that's from the extraction of raw materials to the disposal of the product by the end user. It provides an understanding of impacts and hotspots that need attention, which can be used to inform modifications and improve the product's environmental performance. Now, ISO 14040 sets out 4 stages for the life cycle analysis. The first is the kind of goal and scope stage, which sets the context, boundaries, and assumptions for the study. And that's the study of life cycle inventory. An inventory of all material flows, energy flows, and emissions at each stage of the life cycle. And then you've got the life cycle impact assessment, which quantifies the environmental impact of the life cycle inventory. So that looks at the material and energy flows that are translated into their contribution to the environmental impact categories, and that's defined in the scope and the goal at the original stage. And then the interpretation stage assesses the reliability of the results of that assessment and determines what conclusions, limitations, and recommendations can be drawn from that assessment. So most life cycle assessments and analysis involve several iterations until the most reliable results are achieved. Now, in a linear economy, which is a cradle to grave, materials are recycled only when it makes environmental and economic sense. The circular economy, which is a cradle to cradle, is characterised by the fact that it aims to create a sustainable economy. It is formed of a continuous loop that emulates natural cycles and where recycling is mandatory. So the resource recovery process is seen as a way of sourcing raw materials rather than diverting waste from landfill. And sorting individual materials from mixed waste stream is really challenging. And it's made even more difficult when different materials are used in the same product. So design for disassembly means designing products that are made easy to recover quality materials for recycling at their end of life. And the basic principles are that you choose the right number and type of materials for maximum recyclability. You label the materials so they can be easily identified for recovery, and choose joints and fastening that make the recovery of materials as easy as possible, using a number of principles. So design the product so that it requires the minimum number of variety of fastenings. Use them like snap, click, and shot on, in and out of the place whenever needed. And it should be without the need for a tool. And where screws, bolts are used, and the standard types should be used to ensure the fastenings are accessible, and avoid using glues and bonds. So why would anyone want to buy a handrail? The plastic, the metal, the motor in them have little value to the user. It's the holes that the drill makes that the user actually wants. Similarly, nobody really wants to own a photocopier. What they want is to be able to copy documents. And Xerox, for example, would rather sell you the copies and keep the ownership of the photocopier itself, which they design for lifelong and upgradability, rather than for planned obsolescence and replacement. So this concept is selling the service rather than the product, known as Product Service System, or PSS. And one of the best established PSSs is a chemical management service. So instead of actually selling the solvent itself, the CMS provider will sell you a solvent service. It will provide the solvent along with all necessary equipment, advice on how it should be used, and then recover it after use and recycle it for the next use. So when we were looking just now at the circular economy, we talked about this design for disassembly. Now, to make that circular economy happen, we have to be able to recover useful resources from redundant products. So firstly, let's look at traditional recycling processes. I mean, the most post-consumer waste is sorted by hand by a material recycling facility, typically operating stand on either side of the conveyor belt, and each is tasked with picking out a particular material like cardboard or plastic and bottles and removing containment of greasy pizza boxes. So certain materials can be separated through simple mechanical means. And then the design for disassembly is the solution to avoid mixing waste streams and downcycling, and that's to design products with disassembly in mind. And implementing this discipline is highly dependent on the type of product concerned, but the basic principles are that you choose the number and type of materials for maximum recyclability, you label those that can be easily identified for recovery, and you choose joints and fastening to make recovery of those materials easy as possible. Now, there are two perspectives when considering environmentally friendly materials. You've got eco-friendly materials and materials that fit into a circular economy. So eco-efficient materials get a good score on the life cycle assessment compared to the alternatives. They have characteristics such as low embodied energy. And this is the energy required to extract the material and process into a usable material or component. You've got low ecological rucksack and material input per unit. This relates to the materials involved in producing the raw material. So for metal, this will include removing soil and rock above from the ore itself and all the waste arising from it, purification, low toxicity. So the circular economy does require resources to flow in loops, which can happen in the following ways. Traditional biological nutrients with the natural world, like sheep's wool, can be used for housing insulation and can be decomposed and returned to the environment at its end of life. So endlessly recycling artificial technical nutrients in the economy, like turning plastic bottles into fabric or other plastic items through the recycling process, can only be downcycled. So ISO 14001 is an environmental management standard. It was published in 2004, but revised again later in 2015. And it provides a framework identifying, prioritizing and acting on environmental impacts of the organization. So you can be assessed and certified against the standard, but you'd need to demonstrate continuous improvement each time the certification process takes place, which is clearly a very powerful driver for positive environmental action. But many organisations will require ISO 14001 or an equivalent environmental management system as a minimum. This can make it difficult for small businesses or SMEs to compete due to the cost of maintaining the environmental management system. But the three basic elements of ISO is that you need to comply with legislation, you need to prevent pollution and always do continuous improvement using the Deming Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle on the left-hand side of the screen. But in 2015, the updates included a greater prominence of environmental management within the organisation's strategic direction and a greater commitment from leadership. And the implementation of proactive initiatives to protect the environment from harm and degradation, like sustainable resources used and climate change mitigation. So there is a focus on life cycle thinking to ensure environmental aspects from a cradle to grave are considered, but meaning the supply chain is now very much part of a standard. The additional stakeholder focused communication has also been considered. But these are the sort of clauses on the right-hand side. These are the main clauses, because the first three are preamble anyway. But clause 4 looks at the context of the organisation, so looking at both internal and external factors like steeple. Leadership is around making sure that senior managers are committed to the environmental management system, so it must be integrated into your business process. Clause 6 around planning has been restructured to take into account both positive and negative environmental impacts on activities, products and services, all from a kind of life cycle perspective. Support, this covers all supporting requirements regarding resources, competency, awareness, communication, and the management of documented information. And clause 8 is operation. This includes the whole product life cycle. It basically encourages organisations to design their operations to guarantee consistency and eliminate errors. Clause 9 looks at performance evaluation. So here, the section is required to be monitored, measured and documented for significant impacts, objectives, compliance obligations and operational control over the life cycle. And finally, the 10th one, the improvement clause, sets out the continuous improvements that are required that underpins ISO 14001. And the two elements are about improving environmental performance and correcting non-compliance to ensure that the environmental management itself improves over time. Now in 2017, ISO released a 2400 guidance standard on sustainable procurement. Now, unlike 14001, an organisation cannot be certified to this standard. It's purely for guidance. So a number of organisations offer a review against this standard for a small fee, but a certificate will not be awarded. And it should be noted that the 2400 covers a wide range of social, ethical and human rights issues, in addition to the environmental sustainability that you've already learnt about. The standard has 4 main clauses, but again, the first 3 are preambles and definitions. So clause 4 looks at fundamentals around concepts, principles, core subjects and drivers and key considerations. Clause 5 looks at policy and strategy, which is integrating sustainability into your procurement policy. So here we see things like commitment and clarifying accountability, aligning it with objectives and setting priorities. Clause 6 are the enablers of the organisation of procurement function. So we'll look at governance and enabling people, identifying stakeholders, setting priorities, measuring performance. And the 7th clause is about the process, which is integrating sustainability into your procurement process, from planning, specs, selecting suppliers, managing the contract, and even through to the review. So what is the impact on strategic policy and planning? So before we start working on building a sustainable supply chain, it's going to be quite important to understand the business case in the first place, which is the reasons justification for the activity, because it's got some expected commercial benefit. And obviously the business case will vary from one organisation to another, so it's important to get a really good understanding of the drivers in your case. And by using this information to align your green procurement priorities with your organisation's aims, it will not only be seen as a benefit, but it will help you to avoid any sort of conflicting situations as much as possible. So this is pretty much the business case for the green procurement. But then we've got generic terms of the drivers for sustainability, which come from kind of legislation and regulations. Because while the sustainability world is determined to go beyond compliance, breaching any of the countless environmental rules set by governments around the world would lead to a fine. And then we have cost pressure and security of supply. In the 20th century, things like crude oil prices rarely reached $20 a barrel. But in 2005, they started to surge and spike to over $130 a barrel. So many economists believe that this was a pin that was about to burst the debt bubble, leading to the worldwide banking crash. And environmental risk reduction. I mean, obviously, any toxic material is a risk to the environment, but a number of relative benign substances are also a risk, depending on the situation. So, for example, the release of milk into a river can have devastating effects as the microorganism that consumes the milk multiply rapidly to use up dissolved oxygen, choking the wildlife. You've got employee risk reduction as well. So, you know, looking at sort of recruitment and retention and engagement is also an interesting thing to think about, because employees are increasingly demanding better environmental and social performance from their employer or their potential employer. And at least 12 peer-reviewed academic studies have found that a positive correlation between a business environmental and social performance affects how they're attractive as an employer. Reputational damage and brand protection. Think back to 2011. The Beijing-based Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs claimed Apple's Chinese suppliers frequently fail to properly disclose hazardous waste and dispose of it in the right way. But Apple has made a commitment that it's a green company. So how do you fulfill your commitments if you don't consider you have responsibility for your suppliers' pollution? Now, none of the non-government organisations, they do not attack or even name the suppliers themselves, or indeed the multitude of the Western brands that use the same supplier, but they pick Apple because of its high profile. It means that they will get the headlines. And this is known as the tall poppy syndrome, which is the tendency to criticise prominent or successful individuals. So the highest profile brand will get targeted because they stand out. And then customer demand and new opportunities. In the same way that reputational damage can migrate up the value chain of your organisation, it can also flow through to your customers. And it's becoming increasingly common that customers are demanding that first-tier suppliers take responsibility for the lower-tier suppliers. Investor share pressure. I mean, you know, there's been a long-term study by Harvard Business School, and he found that, you know, a group of highly sustainable corporations really outperformed an equivalent group from a low sustainability company across a wide range of financial metrics, because the return to shareholders of the formal group was 50% higher than the latter. So that basically debunks the widely held belief that sustainability is a cost to a business. It's not a surprise that shareholders and investors are increasingly taking an interest in the sustainability performance of an organisation. And the last one is the moral imperative. So the idea of business having a strong moral purpose has a long history. So this came from the Quaker family who founded Cadbury's back in 1824. It didn't provide for people with drinking chocolate as an alternative to alcohol. And the modern equivalents like Body Shop and Whole Food markets see a moral imperative in enhancing society and the environment. And these organisations say they do not exist to make a profit. They make a profit in order to carry out a higher purpose. By the time a buyer comes to select a supplier to fulfill a need, most of the critical decisions have been made elsewhere in the business. They purchase raw materials, consumables, energy, services, and so on. And that allows them to meet their customer demands. So the process is constrained by the overall corporate philosophy and how it does it. But how does this flow down into the purchasing decisions? Obviously, the hierarchy of constraints, if it follows the more radical approach that you may wish the innovation in your supply chain to be higher up in order to get the effect. But from a bottom-up level, it starts with the buying decisions, which shows the preferences for the sustainable products. The policy, you know, it will include pushing back on requests for things, or, you know, unless relevant changes are made, then, you know, a conflict could occur. in the operations design, when manufacturing, logistics, or even office-based activity, think about how you operate on a day-to-day basis, the equipment, the components, the materials. And then into the design, the way the organization operates is determined by the design of the product. So it could be a hugely powerful tool for mitigating environmental impacts across the product life cycle. And then the business model is the process or the design of the product or service determined by the whole business model. So when Xerox decided to lease copiers in preference to selling them, this led to a completely different design to ensure longevity and upgradability. In other words, it focused on the through-life cost rather than the capital cost. But then the corporate philosophy right at the top is the overarching constraint in corporate philosophy. How serious is an organization about environmental sustainability? How receptive is it to innovation? And how much does it invest in the future? The answers to such philosophical questions is often the difference between the best organization at sustainability and the rest. Now, the traditional approach to managing the environmental impact of supply chains would be to kind of develop and publish a policy or a code of conduct, embed that policy into your tender documents, require suppliers to complete a questionnaire, and audit the major suppliers or those that are at high risk. So we'll start with the procurement policy and the code of conduct. Here, the principles underpinning your green procurement approach should be set out in the policy. And the purpose is to communicate that both internally and externally, the performance expected from the suppliers of the goods and services. Into the tendering process, the sustainability requirements or lack of them in tenders will shape the environmental footprint of the whole organisation. So they must be chosen carefully. But the requirements are shaped by a hierarchy of constraints. So a range of internal stakeholders need to be involved in the tender process. And there are two types of tender requirements that can drive sustainability: a fixed requirement known as supplier selection, which sets the minimum standards, or reward requirements where tenders are given credit for going above and beyond. And then we've got supplier questionnaire and auditing. So the basic approach here to assessing the performance of suppliers against requirements, you ask them to complete a questionnaire. And that process can require a huge amount of data collection and analysis, depending on reliability of that information flowing easily through many layers of the supply chain. But it is a data burden, and it doesn't only affect the purchaser, but suppliers have to commit to a considerable resource in answering a wide variety of questions. You can use third-party standard, which is a sort of basic sustainable procurement method. So, for example, a popular method would be to insist on products meeting sort of third-party standards like eco-labels, Forest Stewardship Council, Energy Star for IT equipment, Soil Association for organic food, and so on. And there's a number of advantages for this. The independent party has set a standard in an objective way, including reducing the risk of greenwashing, which is an attempt that some organisations make to kind of mislead you in that what they're doing is environmentally friendly, but it's just a way of distracting you against the potentially harmful things that they're doing. You can rank or blacklist suppliers. So, that's a big policy question as to whether or not companies would be prepared to disqualify an existing supplier due to their environmental performance. Some take the attitude that they will work with them to improve the performance. Others are a little bit more brutal. If you don't make the grade, you're out. Traceability, one of the major challenges of supply chain sustainability is finding out what is in your supply chain. And with globalized chains across borders and different legislations, this is becoming quite difficult. So traceability is quite key. And there are two main opinions or options of whether or not you want to embed this into your contract agreement. The first one is called a chain of custody, which is a paper trail proving the changing ownership of a substance. And the second will be driving traceability through supply chain tender requirements. And then if we move on to the innovation in the supply chain, I mean, the main disadvantage of traditional supply chain management is that it doesn't always encourage innovation. And the mindset is that the responsibility of the purchasing company to police the supply chain, and suppliers need to meet whatever's been set out in that tender. But this also assumes that customers know what is possible, but that's not always the case. So there are 3 techniques to encourage supplier innovation. We've got outcome-based procurements, which is defining the outcomes required from the goods and services rather than from a product, goods or service. You've got forward commitment procurement. So this is defining the vision of what you will require in 5 years' time, for example. And investing in supply chain, providing financial resources for suppliers to innovate. Now, carbon dioxide is the main contributor to climate change. So carbon footprinting is a process of eliminating and estimating the total contribution to global warming of an organisation or product. The standard text of calculating a carbon footprint is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and it defines 3 scopes for a carbon footprint. You have scope 1, which is emissions from processes undertaken by your organisation. So, for example, emissions from vehicles owned by your business. The second is emissions from generation of electricity consumed by your organisation. And scope 3 usually dominates the footprint. So, for example, Unilever estimate that scope 3 makes up 90% of its footprint because it's all the stuff that you've basically outsourced, it's all indirects. So an organisation's carbon footprint can be reduced by one of 2 low carbon purchasing options. Purchasing products with low embodied carbon, that is products that emit a low amount of carbon during the extraction of raw materials and production of the product or service. So this will clearly reduce the scope of your scope 3. Or you purchase products and services with minimal carbon emissions in the use or disposal, which will reduce the scope 1 and 2 emissions. So ensuring that all costs are considered during through-life costing or redesigning operations or products that have a low energy component to be specified. But waste leaks out at every step of the process of extracting raw materials to turn products which are ultimately a throwaway. So waste minimisation is a systematic process of reducing waste wherever possible. And the basic of waste minimisation is a waste hierarchy. And there are more comprehensive versions of this, from reduce, reuse, repair, recycle, recover, but ultimately it's all about trying to, where possible, reduce the waste that you actually produce. Where possible, reuse it. I mean, it doesn't mention repair in here, but you could, if you think about furniture, instead of throwing things away, we could repair things. The next thing might be to recycle. And you can actually recover energy from sort of decomposition and things like that. But the very last resort, of course, will be going to landfill. So if we think about some examples of applying the waste hierarchy in procurement, we could talk about smart purchasing to match quantities and qualities needed, or appropriate ordering and storage of perishable goods, using lean manufacturing to reduce the amount of waste in the system, or careful design of the workplace to avoid damage to goods, separating materials with high calorific value from residual waste, which can be used for energy recovery. And the circular economy aims to keep material flowing in loops by using recycling to produce the next generation of raw materials. So industrial symbiosis is the concept of one company's waste becoming a raw material for another. Like a blast furnace, slag from steel production can be used in asphalt as an alternative to virgin aggregates. Water is vital to life on Earth, and therefore is only one of the most precious resources. And there is an abundance of water on the planet, but only 3% of fresh water, and 2/3 of that is locked up in ice shelves and glaciers. So sources of water for the economy will include rainwater that can be harvested directly as it falls, surface water, which is extraction from lakes and rivers, that represents just over 1% of fresh water, and then groundwater, which is extraction from aquifers. you've got stores of fresh water in porous rocks, and that represents about 30% of fresh water. And then biodiversity is a variety of plant and animal life in the world or in a particular habitat. It's usually at risk from human activities. Excessive harvesting can lead to overexploitation of extinction. Habitat loss can be caused by agriculture, urban expansion, and indirect land use change can lead to deforestation or the loss of important natural habitats. So, for example, when farmers clear land to grow the food required to switch from food production agriculture to biofuel, this can mean the carbon benefits of biofuels are lost. And if alien species are important, they can destroy or outcompete the indigenous species. So, for example, the comb jellyfish native to the coast of America has been carried in ship ballast waters to the Black Sea, causing a near collapse of the local fishing industry. And harmful chemical pollutants can put all wildlife at risk. So changing temperatures caused by climate change can result in rapid changes in habitats, which can threaten the species. In most cases of extinction, a combination of factors that contribute to the species being unable to survive. So, for example, the extinction of the dodo has been blamed on the combined pressure of overhunting, habitat loss, and the introduction of rats. So biodiversity and the supply chain is when addressing those concerns, particular circumstances need to be considered. And some general principles apply, such as protecting stocks. So heed scientific advice on conservation of natural resources, requiring third-party standards like FSC and MSC eco-labels, switch to more plentiful alternatives, and insist on strict traceability standards to ensure the provenance of resources. And then protect the habitats, place habitat protection restrictions on suppliers, invest in biodiversity-friendly technology and techniques, and choose alternatives sourced from non-sensitive areas, and invest in conservation projects to protect important habitats. And then finally, about guarding against alien species. Put in place a strict biosafety control to avoid transfer of species, especially around shipping. So the last thing I'm going to talk to you about today is international targets and agreements. And when you consider the business case for sustainable procurement, you'll find out that compliance with regulations was the foundation of the case. But international agreements and regulations reflect long-term economic trends, and new regulations often present business opportunities. And there are a huge number of international targets and agreements, but only the 5 are most relevant to supply chains considered in detail in this particular book. And the first one is the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations. There are obviously 17 goals that are going to transform our world by the year 2030. They superseded the 8 Millennium Goals. And we've got no poverty, no hunger, good health and well-being, and a quality education. We want gender equality and clean water and sanitation, as well as affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, as well as industry innovation and infrastructure. We want reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, and to take action against climate change, as well as life below water and life on land. We want peace, justice, and strong institutions, and a partnership for the goals. And the other one I wanted to bring to your attention was the Paris Agreement, which was signed by 195 states in December 2015. The aim is about reducing carbon emissions, adapting to climate change, and providing climate finance to developing countries. So it's all about keeping the increase of global average temperatures well below 2 degrees centigrade, preferably to about 1.5. And the precursor for this, it started out in 1992 with the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, which then became the Kyoto Protocol in 2006. But as the years have gone on, the world has realized that we need stronger provisions. And the Paris Agreement is the one that we're working to now. But there are similar ones like the Stockholm Convention and the Montreal Protocol. So just a few additional ones around the world that you might want to kind of consider or think about. But that is the end of Learning Outcome 3. Thank you very much for watching.